Okay. As we announced a few weeks ago, we're working through the life and times of Jesus, and we're syncing up with the other groups. So what we're doing today here in the adult group is also taking place in the Mosaic group and the young people as well. So we're kind of all syncing these things up together. And we're going to be looking today at the very famous account of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So I'm going to make you all work today. We were talking actually at Alpha, weren't we, Vicky, about sometimes have these mega churches, and sometimes it's great to see these huge churches like Willow Creek, where Warren is, and other churches. But there are also benefits in having smaller churches. And one of the benefits of having smaller churches is that I can pick on people, we can be interactive, and we can sort of get people working together, which you couldn't quite do in a big auditorium. So we're going to take advantage of that this morning. So I'd like you all, if you've got a Bible, if you haven't got a Bible, grab one from the back, get your phone out if you use the Bible on your phone. Use whatever version you like, it doesn't matter. In fact, if you have different versions, even better. And turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 13. Oh, I should be standing in front of the camera, shouldn't I? That might help. Turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 13. And we're going to look at the verses 1 to 17. And we're going to walk through this in exactly the same way as if you were doing this at home. If you were taking the Bible and you were just reading through this passage, we're just going to walk through the verses one at a time with that. So what I'd like us to do is just for someone to read each verse. So in your loudest sort of auditorium voice, I'm going to ask people to read each of these verses. So we've got at least 17 people here, which is good. So that means we can get 17 people to read out different verses. So who would like to go first and read verse 1 in your loudest voice? Thanks, Linda.
It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love.
The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus.
Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God.
So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist.
After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was rubbed around.
And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?"
Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand."
"No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." And Lord, son of Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have no part need only to wash the feet, and whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you."
And next.
For he knew he was going to betray him, and that was why he said, "Not everyone was clean."
When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them.
You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am.
Now define the Lord and teacher how to wash your feet. You should also wash others' feet.
I have set you an example that you should do as I want to do. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one.
Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do.
Thank you very much. That works better than I thought it would. Great job, everybody. That's good. So yeah, so we'll just go through that passage, and it's a familiar passage, isn't it, to many of us. Those of us who've read the gospel will be familiar with this passage, and we've probably seen it on Jesus films and things like that. So let's just sort of work through this verse by verse, and just sort of see what we think may do of it. So verse 1, would anybody like to sort of say what's Jesus saying here? Anybody like to hazard a guess, or to just say what is Jesus saying here in verse 1 about what's happening next?
God's plan is starting.
God's plan starting, yeah, absolutely. The conclusion of everything that Jesus came to do is about to happen. Yeah.
Preparing his disciples.
Yeah.
Jesus seemed to be in control of the next one.
So
Jesus seemed to be in control, wasn't it?
yeah, Jesus was in control. It wasn't things that were happening to him. He was in control of that. Yeah. Okay, lots of really interesting thoughts there. And this is, this is a great thing about studying things together. We get sort of different perspectives on things. As I was looking through it, the thing which sort of stood out to me was that Jesus knew that he was going to die this death on the cross. He knew that that was the conclusion that was just about to come. And this, in a sense, was like the ultimate love sacrifice. And he calls us to do the same, but I guess not many of us are going to be called to die on a cross or to do anything similar to that. So the second part of the verse, where he says he's about to show the full extent of his love, as Linda read out in that version, or it says in some versions like he was going to love them to the end, to the conclusion. He's now about to give an example of the same kind of love, but perhaps an example that we are more able to follow with that. So death on the cross probably not going to happen to many of us, but the example he's just about to set is something that we can perhaps follow. So looking at verse 2, I guess there's not sort of much to say there about that, apart from the sort of fairly obvious that they were just about to celebrate the Passover meal, which was very familiar to them. They would have done this every year to celebrate the fact that God passed over the Israelite houses because they put blood on the doorposts. We talked about this actually, didn't we, on an Alpha on Thursday? That God passed over them, and that they were spared the death that came from the rebellion of Pharaoh at that time.
I think also the verse is saying that there is a spiritual enemy who works in a practical way through real people.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, we could almost got these two sort of dimensions going on. We've got the spiritual dimension, but then that is worked out probably in similar ways. So there's a spiritual dimension that Jesus has got, in terms of showing his love, but he works it out in a practical way. But the devil also has a plan, and he's going to work that out through Judas with that. Yeah, so verse 2. One thing which stood out to me was that his death had come through the sort of the ultimate betrayal, that is by a friend. And it makes what comes next even more remarkable, because we see that he doesn't single out anybody. He performs this act of service to everybody, including Judas, who's about to betray him. Okay, looking at verse 3, then. Anybody got any comments about verse 3? Jesus knew who he was. Yeah. So that parallels what someone was saying, like Mike was saying about he knew that the events were about to happen, and yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I sort of saw verse 3 as kind of like a re-expression of the first part of verse 1 with that.
I think also that power is an important word as well. That all authority is given to Jesus.
Yeah.
And he has the power in the situation, and he now gives us the power in any situation over the spiritual battle.
Yeah. So Jesus has power, and that power is going to be demonstrated through him rising again, the ultimate display of that power. But that same power he vests in us as well. Yeah.
For me, verses 1 to 3 is actually almost like the canvas on which the whole, what is then going to happen, takes place.
Yeah.
It's like the background information, what we need to know, like setting the scene, like what Mel just did.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Different players.
Sure. Yeah, there's as we've said, we've got Jesus, we've got Judas, the spiritual dimension of God and the devil as well playing out. Yeah, thanks. That's great. And then sort of verse 4. So, oops, yeah. I saw verses 4 and 5. I don't know what you think, but I saw that then as a kind of practical demonstration of that second part of verse 1. So the second part of verse 1 says, having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed the full extent of his love. And now we see in verses 4 and 5 that demonstration of his love in a very practical way. Does anybody, as you read those verses again, which I'm sure you're all familiar, you've probably read these verses, you've probably seen these verses, were taught in Sunday school. As you read them again, is there anything that stands out to you? Servant heart, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was looking in my sort of electronic Bible. It sort of has nice ways of referencing back to the Old Testament. And actually, back in the Old Testament, so the Jewish tradition, which was carried on, was it was very common for people to give water for people to wash their own feet. That's on after a long dusty journey. Whereas we would take someone's coat, the sort of equivalent in those days would say, "Hey, you had a really hard journey. You're going to be a bit grimy. Here's some water to wash your feet with." That would be the sort of the common practice with that. But that would be for them to wash their own feet. And then if you're really rich, then you had servants, then you might get your lowliest servant to do that. And yet, as you were saying, Sonia, what's an amazing act of humility. He doesn't just give them water, he actually does it himself. Yeah, absolutely. And any other reflections on those verses? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you would think his mind would be on other things. He knew that he was about to experience this incredible, both spiritual and physical pain, but still he took care of this thing. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I like that. You see that ultimately displayed on the cross, don't you? Where although he must have been in agony, he took care of his mother. And said, "Mother, here's going to be your son," and sort of so he was always thinking of other people.
Verse 3 doesn't seem to fit with any of the other things around. It seems to be a statement that something that Jesus knew, but no one else had for it.
Yeah.
It just seems to be dropped in there.
Yeah. And so in a sense, he knew that he'd been given, or all things were under his power, it says. So this is Jesus, like the person who created the universe, the person who, as it says on the cross, he could have called a legion of angels, all things under his power. And it's dropped in, I think, yes, in a sense, but also perhaps it's kind of contrasting that here's someone who had all this power and yet stoops. And so often today we see people who have tremendous power and yet they use their power for their own personal gain. And yet Jesus here, although he had all that power, that he didn't use that for his own gain. Instead, he actually essentially relinquished the power that he had when he went to the cross. Okay, so the next bit, verse 6. Here we have Simon Peter, the Simon Peter that we know and love. What a great character he is. How do you sort of like imagine this? So Simon Peter comes up to him and says, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" sort of saying, no, you're not going to do this, surely. Then Jesus replies, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Jesus, you will never wash my feet. So he's Peter sort of like being very sort of dogmatic, like he always is adamant that Jesus isn't going to wash his feet. So then Jesus replies and says, unless I wash you, you will have no part with me. And so Peter, of course, wants to have every part. He wants to, he loves Jesus. He wants to have everything of Jesus. And so then what does he respond? In verse 9. Not just my feet, but my hands and my head. So and then how does Jesus respond to that? Yeah, a person who has a bath needs only to wash his feet and make his whole body clean. So what does everybody think about those verses? Sometimes maybe we can sort of understand Peter, but do we understand what Jesus' responses are with that?
Yeah, I love verse 6. I think it's fantastic because I think Peter's just shocked.
Yeah.
It shows respect. I mean, he's seen Jesus calm storms, he's seen him transfigured on the mountain, and he sees him coming to, and I think it's a sign of utter shock and respect that what? You're going to, I should be cleaning my feet.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, Jesus has to put it right.
Yeah.
But I think it's an amazing sign of respect and love.
Yes, yes. I mean,
And even imagine Peter pulling his feet away and saying, surely you have not you taught, right?
yeah.
It's not respectable then. Right?
Yeah. So like so sort of like he sees Jesus as his teacher
Yeah.
and doesn't want to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as I read it, I mean, this is Peter sort of he thinks he knows what's right, and maybe he thinks that the other disciples have kind of missed the point, and so he says, surely you're not going to let Jesus wash their feet, and that's kind of what sort of I read of it with that, and then I suppose we like Peter sort of have to acknowledge that we need washing with that. So that's why Jesus replies that you do not realize now what I'm doing, you will understand. And he says, unless I wash you, you will have no part of me. So Jesus was doing more than just a physical act here, wasn't he? He was also saying something about the fact that we need cleansing. And in a sense, Peter sort of had to then sort of respond to Jesus in a different way and understand and say to Jesus, yes, okay, you're going to clean me. But then Peter goes one step further, doesn't he, and says that he wants that complete cleansing. So what do you make of that next in verses 9 when Jesus answers? Sorry, verses 10. When Jesus answers, he who has a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean. What does anybody make of those verses?
Trying to help them understand the symbols.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
He's going to give us forgiveness. Even though that's what's going to happen while doing that, he's going to give them forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly offers forgiveness to anybody who's willing to accept it. So what do you think about Judas? So Judas here also had his feet washed, which is amazing, really, because Jesus knew what he was about to do. What do we think about Judas here? So they all had their feet physically washed. Was there something else going on here? To me, it sort of wonders whether, is there a heart thing as well? Is that Peter got to the stage through his conversation with Jesus that he needed that cleansing, and there was that spiritual dimension. But Judas, although he was physically washed, in his heart, we know that there was something different going on. And so he accepted that physical washing, but in his heart, he hadn't fully accepted what Jesus was about to do. Yeah. Yeah.
people about
Yeah. A cold heart. I mean, that was the amazing thing, was that Judas had experienced all the things that all the other disciples had. They'd seen Jesus' remarkable power. They'd had sort of that intimate teaching with Jesus. Not only had they seen the Sermon on the Mount, but they'd also had those kind of one-to-ones where Jesus had explained a little bit more what he was saying. So he'd experienced that, but nevertheless, he'd got a cold heart. And so it's kind of I think something which just should speak to us is, are we, sometimes we can just do things physically and we forget that we need to sort of do things in our heart as well. You know, we can do things outwardly, but God really looks at our hearts with that.
That's the whole thing about faith and works, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, and so that is that combination of those two things, is that someone who's truly following Jesus has a faith in Jesus and will do works. But if you're just doing works, but you're not really doing it for the right reasons and for Jesus, yeah, then there's warnings against that for sure.
It says, and you are clean, though not every one of you. It was a last attempt for giving Judas an opportunity to say, I know that's me. Because God could have worked it all through in a different way.
Yes, yeah, he would have still been somehow put on the cross. Absolutely, God's plan wasn't going to be thwarted. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. There's lots of points actually through the meal where if you had been in the know like Judas had been, you would know what he was saying. He was kind of inferring that someone was going to betray him. The disciples didn't have a clue apart from Judas. And as you say, Kate, Jesus was always giving him that chance to do that. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely take what you were saying, Derek, about sort of like how Peter, you know, wanted to sort of respect his teacher, but Peter, being Peter, would always think that he knew slightly better than that. And so again, it's just I think just to say that I think we just need to sometimes be humble before Jesus and accept what he says. Sometimes he says things which we are surprised at, and maybe it goes against our natural inclination with that. And sometimes Jesus may be saying to us something we don't anticipate. And if we're truly listening to God, then we can follow that sort of message.
But Peter is actually, I think, really teachable. You know,
Yes.
He sort of, first he says, no, not at all, and then he says, oh my, but then.
Yeah.
So, and it's within one breath, you know.
Yeah.
I think he's very, yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
No, I would agree totally with that. But I mean, I think it shows Peter that he obviously doesn't see the big picture.
Yeah.
And yet, once it's shown him, he's got it.
Yeah.
See it again.
Yeah.
Until, you know, once he's got the big picture, then it's fantastic.
Yeah.
He's very open.
That's true. Yeah, so that's a good point, actually. Is that sometimes, I mean, perhaps I've been a bit critical of Peter here, and we were talking actually again at Alpha on Thursday about doubting Thomas, and sometimes we can be critical of doubting Thomas, but often we will be exactly like Thomas. I mean, I would have been like Thomas. I would have wanted to see, yeah, are you really that same person? And maybe like Peter here, sometimes we can be a bit critical of Peter, but as you were saying, Regina, he was, you know, although perhaps he had his own ideas, as soon as he was Jesus pointed out the right thing, then he responded to that. And maybe that's a really good lesson for us here this morning, is that when we hear something from Jesus, let us immediately respond to that. Let's not sort of dig our heels in and say, oh no, Jesus, I know best, but instead respond immediately to that.
I would think that the disciples believed and trusted in Jesus. And so when Jesus said about they're clean because they had accepted Jesus.
Yeah.
As their Savior and their Lord. Whereas
Sure.
Jesus was fitting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so most of the disciples, 11 of the disciples, plus many others too, of course, had responded to that and had seen their need for cleanliness. I think we see that in in like Matthew, for sure, you know, he knew he needed forgiveness, and knew that Jesus was able to cleanse him, and certainly for all the other disciples too. But Judas, somehow, it just shows that, you know, that we can sometimes harden our hearts, as Beryl was saying. So some people think that this verse also means this, is that although Jesus cleansed our sins once and for all, so we are clean, but sometimes we need to tap into our forgiveness on a daily basis. So when it says here, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet, some people would anticipate this basically means is that we have been cleansed, we are clean, we don't need to worry about confessing all of our sins, but there is also a need to be, to a sense, to sort of tap into that forgiveness that we have, you know, not to be overcome by guilt, to acknowledge that we've done wrong, but then just to tap into that cleanness and be cleaned by Jesus on a daily basis, in the sense of, I feel guilty, Lord, I feel I've done things wrong, please cleanse me. Knowing that I've been forgiven, I know that it can be cleaned. Okay, so moving on then, onto the next verses. So onto verses 12. So it says that when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. Well, that is what I am. It's going back to what people were saying earlier on about this respect that they should have had for his teacher. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. So, any reflections on that, on that, those sort of set of verses? Okay. Sure, yeah. So you're, in a sense, you're sort of, you're asking for this cleansing, are you? Is that right? So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's, if anything, this is about example for sure, because it talks about sort of master and how, if he's done it, then how much more should we all do it? Just one thing I forgot to say just now, actually, in verse 12, it says, when he has finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. I read this really interesting bit where it says, there's a whole sort of set of contrast we can have here. So we were talking earlier on about the physical and the spiritual. And there's, as we read through the story, there's this sort of sense that maybe there's a kind of another sort of like almost picture going on here that Jesus is saying. So Jesus rose from supper, a place of rest and comfort. And we could say that this is like Jesus rose from his throne in heaven, which was also a place of rest and comfort. And then talks early on in the passage about Jesus laid aside his garments, taking off his covering. And this could be similar to Jesus laid aside his glory from heaven, taking off his heavenly covering to come down to earth. And then it says here that Jesus took his towel and girded himself, being ready to do the work of washing the feet. And this could be, again, talking about Jesus taking the form of his servant, coming down to earth, ready to do his work. So there's kind of like a parallel going on here. And as we read on further, Jesus poured the water into a basin, ready to be cleaned. And this is sort of like a symbol of Jesus pouring out his blood to cleanse us from our sins. And then finally, as we read here just in verse 12, Jesus sat down again after washing their feet. This is like Jesus then, after his resurrection, sat down at the right hand of God and the Father cleansing us. So there's a nice sort of pattern here, which is maybe symbolizing again Jesus' complete work, as someone was talking about it earlier on. So verses 13 to 17, so we've had some reflections on that. As I read it, just a few things that I said to me is that if you look on in verses, right onto verses 34 in the same chapter, a very familiar verse to all of us, I'm sure. A new commandment I give to you, love one another, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. So maybe this is our ultimate example of that. Linda, you were saying about this being an example. And Jesus says there in verse 34, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. So this is kind of like that ultimate demonstration of how we can do, of the kind of thing we can do.
Yeah, I think, because I've also been saying to us as a church recently, that not just to be hearers of the word, but doers.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think that where Peter sees something and he suddenly understands it, but he's still actually then got to go and do it.
Yeah.
What Jesus is saying, it's not just seeing it and understanding it, it's then going out and doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think God has been saying that to us.
Yeah. So that's really helpful. Ties in with the faith and works thing. Is that, yeah, is that we have to actually do something with that faith. Yes, Maria. Yeah. Yeah.
And he's saying to them that as he's washing their feet, so that they should, because what's going to happen is not going to be there, and they're going to feel like, what's going on, Jesus is gone.
Yeah.
That they should care for each other, look after each other,
Yeah.
wash each other's feet, come together as a group.
Yeah.
And look after each other and love each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that at all. But yeah, they were just about to be thrown into complete confusion, right? Yeah, they didn't know. And even after Jesus' death, they were in a state of shock, I think, after that. And maybe, yeah, Jesus was saying, do acts of service to help one another, to comfort one another with that. Absolutely. I hadn't thought about that. But great. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I would love to have known actually what happened sort of in those days afterwards, before the day of Pentecost, how the disciples responded. Sorry, Regina, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think it's also didactically, it's just, well, clever is the wrong word, but it's powerful because, where we saw, you hear, from what you hear, you only remember, I don't know, 10 or 20% or so. If
Yeah.
you see it,
Yeah.
if you also see it, you remember a bit more. If you also experience it,
Right.
So, and like the washing, they all set the water.
Yeah.
They all felt dirty before and clean afterwards. I think that was going to stick, and that was actually very important because it's not just a one-off. That should translate into an attitude.
Yeah, yeah.
An attitude that doesn't come to us naturally.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, and he does that just before he dies.
Yeah,
So like, what's the climax as well?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. We were actually strangely in the car, I'm not sure how we got onto it, we were talking about memorizing things and how you get things into your memory. We're talking about times tables and things like that. And with that, and one way of learning is actually by doing things, or by singing a song, or by something where you're actually doing more than just looking at words on a page or something like that. So yeah, absolutely. I'm sure the disciples, because they would have been so shocked, as you were saying, Derek, Peter's completely shocked by it because it was just so countercultural, that would have stuck in their minds for a long time to come with that. Yeah, absolutely.
So what stops us from following Jesus' example? I was just thinking about this because sometimes teach on the edge. We don't want to make mistakes, or we're not sure. And I just think about Peter, and he went for it and he made loads of mistakes. But in a sense, it helped him to learn and to move forward, didn't it?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we know what we should do, but we are on the edge thinking, oh, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
If I've got it wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's really spoke to me.
Right.
Because Peter, does all sorts of stupid things, but at least he's got the enthusiasm and the love for Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. And probably actually this lesson of washing the feet probably hit home even more to him, because he sort of like blundered and burst out stuff, and Jesus sort of gently actually sort of corrected him. So probably in Peter's mind, it stuck even harder. Yeah, really good question. So yeah, what else stops us from doing these servant kind of things? Pride. Yeah, pride. So what might, just give me an example of how pride might get in the way? We don't like to do what, sorry?
We don't like to look bad.
Don't like it to bad. No, yeah, we don't like to look a bit. Yeah, we don't like to be seen as being different and doing something strange. Beryl, you had your hand up?
When we walk away from it, we don't have that confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so you're saying really sometimes we have to just go for it and we have to do something, even if it's calling, Jesus is calling to do something a bit unexpected, we have to do it in confidence. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe not actually portraying Jesus like Jews did, but at least having our agenda.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we haven't quite sort of got what Jesus wants us to do, and we're powering on. Is that what you're saying? Sort of?
Yeah, kind of just we've got other things to do, we're doing this, or,
Yeah, selfish.
Yeah, a bit selfish, yeah.
Right, I see. Yeah. So you're sort of like self-centered rather than Jesus-centered. Yeah. I mean, as I've said here in this last bit, I mean, I was struck by the fact that not just being servant-hearted for those who treat us well, but even for those who disappoint us, let us down, hurt us, betray us. Jesus tells us to love our enemies, and probably we don't think of ourselves as having enemies. Really, it's a bit of a strange concept, but basically, I think by enemies it just means that those who we feel in some ways hurt us or in some ways are getting at us. And Jesus calls us to be servant-hearted even to those kind of people. And that's kingdom living. That's radical living, which is really hard to do. But it's the kind of living that Jesus is calling us to do. Yeah.
So he's been with me a lot this last week. Remember, Jesus did say to them that people would hate them because they hated him.
Yeah.
And because Jesus, gospel is challenging. You need to deal with sin. And it's quite challenging. If you follow Jesus and you do like you will be hated.
Yeah.
By something. Yeah. So I'm just saying that there's a reality it's been with me a lot this last week.
Right. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that if you're true to God's word,
when you step out, then you might look foolish and you might get a bad response. You might get. So you can understand why some people are a bit afraid or step back. Or don't go on with it.
So if you're mocked in some way or something like that, then we're still called to carry on and even actually to love our mockers and to do that. So just sort of in conclusion then, you saw the title there, Thinking of Ourselves Less. This was, I think, something Mel referred to some way back. It says C.S. Lewis quote where it says, true humility isn't thinking less of ourselves, it's thinking of ourselves less. And someone earlier on said about being less selfish and thinking of ourselves. So this is exactly it. Is that Jesus never really thought of himself, he always thought about others in everything that he did. And we see it here in this ultimate act, but we see it ultimately on the cross, of course, with that. So, how do we love one another? So I think the first thing to do is that as Christians, we should be servant-hearted. In other words, we should be thinking ourselves, like Jesus, as servants, and always thinking about how can I be servant-hearted? In what way can I bless others? That should be our attitude. And I think it calls us to be sometimes radical in our servant-heartedness. Washing that feet, that was radical. That was completely out of tradition. And probably we would think, oh, washing someone's feet, that's really pretty horrible with that. I mean, I don't know. Pope Francis, I have quite a lot of respect for him. I don't obviously believe everything that he believes, but he does seem to be someone who really wants to live differently. He doesn't live in the big papal palace. He lives in a smaller place. He didn't want that. And he has, washed people's feet, prisoners' feet, for example, in a sort of, and sort of like you sort of see him sort of kissing their feet. So I'm not saying we should be washing people's feet. I don't think that's what Jesus is calling us to do. But there was someone, a pope, but nevertheless he was prepared to wash people's feet. That's a sort of like a small example, but I think each one of us should be prepared to be radical, do something which is perhaps a bit yucky or a bit something which we don't really like doing with that. And I think that's the last thing, is be sort of intentional in your acts of service. So think up. This is something that, Derek, you've been talking about as a church. How can we be more servant-hearted? How can we go and do something rather than just hearing it? And for me, what spoke to me as I read through this passage was, can I each week somehow think of how can I in some way bless someone, be servant-hearted to someone, do an act of service which is unexpected, maybe to someone who's not expecting it. So the thing for me is like, how can we as individuals and how can we as a church act out this loving one another in a really radical way? I've got a song, Graham Kendrick song I didn't know of before, where he sings about this exact thing. And I'd just like us in the next 4 or 5 minutes with the song, just to listen to this song, maybe just to pray and ask God, how can I be servant-hearted this week? How can we be servant-hearted this week? Pray into it, ask God to speak to you and say, and if he says something, go ahead and do it. Sort of as Peter did, respond to that teaching and go ahead and do it. So let's just listen to this song and ask God to show us how we can be servant-hearted. Just turn my mic off. This is what I'm asking you to do. This is why I'm kneeling here beside you. This is what I want my church to be. This is what I want the world to see, who it is you follow. Lord, may we this week demonstrate that practical love for other people, to show who it is that we follow Jesus. And because you were so servant-hearted, Lord, may we also be servant-hearted. May we take away that pride that so often fills us and stops us doing the things that you want us to do, because we feel we may be mocked, we feel we maybe look stupid, or we don't feel that's a bit beneath us to do that. Lord, may we just put aside all of that and instead have that same heart that you see people in the same way that you do, that each person has value and needs your love. So, Lord God, just touch us this week. Melt our hearts if they're a bit cold and hard. Soften them to have a heart for all of those that are around us. In Jesus' name, we ask these things. Amen. Amen.